Reverend Spy by D P Denton. Chapter 8. Dan stood at the door of the chapel, welcoming people as they entered. 3 weeks had passed, and no word had come from 35 as to his assignment. They had gotten settled in their new home and were getting acquainted with both the town and the people. Dan had naturally kept his eyes and ears open for any information that might be helpful. It had not taken long for him to realize why 35 had wanted him there. An important airplane plant was located here, as well as several other strategic manufacturers of war materials. And the chapel was just 1 block from the railroad terminal, where literally thousands of servicemen changed trains. The city of B was the transportation center of the entire section. When Dan had seen this, he realized immediately how easy it would be for the enemy to use this as a center for learning of military movements and perhaps more important secrets. Now, as he stood at the door greeting each worshiper who arrived, he suddenly found himself looking into the eyes and grasping the hand of 35. Nothing else about the man looked natural. A mustache and beard hid the smile which was usually flitting about his mouth. His clothes were rumpled and well worn, and his speech was that of the ordinary down and outer. "Reverend," he said with something of a whine, "I need help very badly. Could you spare a few minutes to talk to a poor old miserable failure?" The crowd thought nothing of that, for many came in off of the streets to the nightly services at the chapel, and many of them came just for help. So, when Dan led the stranger to a back room and Laurie opened the services, no one, not even Laurie, suspected that something unusual was happening. As soon as 21 Plus and 35 were alone and the door securely shut, 35 exulted, "Man, this is the perfect place for a bum like me to have a private talk with the minister." "Yup," quipped Dan, wondering what had brought his superior here like this. "It would be a good meeting place if you don't run out of disguises. Now what's up?" For he knew that it must be something important. "Remember the phony son of your renter at sea?" "I sure do. What's he up to now?" "The big boy has stolen some highly important papers and is having a bit of trouble getting them out of the country. Our men know most of, if not all, of the big boys now, and they are having a hard time moving about without us knowing it. So now they are using those that aren't so well known. They are sending the big phony son north tomorrow night in hope that he can get into Canada and deliver these papers to their contacts there. Now, can you find an excuse to go to New York? Anywhere in the Niagara Falls area?" "I have an invitation to preach in one of the cities up there any time I can come." "Good." And 35 brightened as he heard Dan's answer. "You know this fellow better than anyone, and none of our men in the north know him. We don't know where he has the papers or how he plans to get them out of the country. All we know is that he will have them somewhere. You will be covered all the time by one of my best men, and he is big enough to protect you. You don't know him, and don't try to identify him. Just be careful and let him handle the rough stuff, unless you are forced to protect yourself. We don't want to lose you. Here's a blanket ticket that will get you to the border and back. Here's some money, and you can get more if you need it. Now what else do you want me to do?" Dan thought for a moment and then slowly said, "Call me after service tonight and urge me to come to that New York church for this coming Sunday. That way I can truthfully say that I was urged to come this week." A few more words of instruction, and caution, and 35 began to look for an exit. Dan laughed as he opened the back door and said, "Sleeping quarters for the transients are in the little building back there. Good night and pleasant dreams." Following the service, the phone rang in the office, and Dan was told that he had a long-distance call. The voice on the other end was familiar, but the message was different. Could he possibly arrange to be at the church in New York on the following Sunday? It was very urgent that he be there, and he agreed. Poor Laurie must have lived in amazement in those days, but she bravely waved her man off the next day when he left for the bus station. Once there, he quickly entered a restroom booth, did a bit of amateur disguising, and walked out to watch as the buses came and went, and finally, on one northbound bus, he spotted his man. The driver accepted his ticket, and Dan hardly breathed as he moved down the aisle, for the agent was closely watching everyone who got on board. Dan was sure that he gave him more than a passing glance, even looked back several times to see him better. But Dan's newspaper both hid his face and his concern. What the agent did not notice was the large, muscular man who came aboard after Dan and took a seat a short distance farther back. But Dan secretly hoped that this was his bodyguard. Mile after mile rolled by, and Dan stayed to himself, thinking and praying over his problem. It was no trouble to find the enemy, for he was right here. But he must locate the papers and get them before the agent could destroy the evidence. That was the hard part. Little did Dan realize how that was to be done, or the danger he would face in doing it. But he was not afraid to wait long. A 2-hour layover at one city brought the solution no nearer. A lengthy stop at Pittsburgh, and when they again boarded the bus, Dan was no closer to the answer than before. Meanwhile, his quarry had been looking at him more and more, and Dan felt sure that he was beginning to see through his disguise. But that was a risk he had to take. He had already decided that he would not allow his man to get across the border into Canada, and if necessary would attack him physically and get them both thrown into jail, where others might locate the secrets. It almost happened. As darkness settled in the next day, a tired, weary, and unshaven Dan followed the enemy agent into the Buffalo, New York terminal. In his mind, he knew that whatever he did, it must be done now. Canada was just a few miles away, and there were many ways for a smart operator to cross the border. Dan felt a tightness inside as he entered the station. The restrooms were upstairs, and Dan's quarry went directly to them. Hesitating for a moment, he climbed the stairs and slowly entered the men's room, knowing that a showdown could not be far away. The enemy agent had already opened his bag and was preparing to shave when Dan entered, but Dan noted that the large mirror where he stood afforded a full view of the entrance and most of the room. At the far end of the room was a smaller mirror and a lavatory. There, Dan made preparations to shave and clean up while keeping a close watch on his enemy. The man had removed his outer shirt and kept on a t-shirt, but with his first glance in the mirror, Dan received a shock and became extremely excited. The man was wearing the regulation dog tag identification around his neck, but attached to that was a string which went beneath his t-shirt, and the bulging place under that shirt told Dan instinctively that here were the missing papers. The battle of nerves that took place during the next few minutes can hardly be imagined. Each of them was carefully watching the other while he tried to shave. Each knew that he had been recognized, and each was waiting for the other to make a move. Neither seemed to know just what to do next. When their shaving was ended, and their clothing adjusted in preparation for leaving, Each tried to delay the next move so that the other would take the lead. And then it happened. The door opened to admit 5 young men in an uproarious condition, well on their way to drunkenness. One of them carried a large grocery sack, and they were soon pulling out bottles of beer in preparation for drinking them. Suddenly a light came over the troubled face of the enemy agent as though he had just formulated a plan of action. Moving toward Dan, he said, "Say, mister, do you want a beer?" "No, thank you," replied a very puzzled Dan. "The Lord saved me from that several years ago." A sneer came from the enemy's face that said plainly that he thought he had Dan under control. "Oh, you're a preacher, huh?" And Dan could only answer that he was by the grace of God. "Hey, fellows, come here." And the agent turned to the 5 drunken young men. "Here's a preacher. Come here and let's give the preacher a drink." And before Dan hardly knew what was happening, and before he could act in any way, he was surrounded by 5 drunks and an enemy spy who were bent on doing him harm. Furthermore, the agent grabbed up a bottle by the neck, and Dan saw clearly what his plan was. Talking rapidly and at the same time trying to think and pray, he tried to convince the fellows that he did not and would not drink. But the enemy kept urging them on, and they continued to close in on him. Dan could see the headlines in the newspapers: "A drunken row in a bus station restroom," "A preacher hit in the head with a bottle and killed," "The smell of alcohol all over him and his bag." And what the public would never know was that an enemy agent had used that means to escape with some precious secrets. Dan was determined that it would not happen if he could help it. When he had backed as far against the wall as he could, he braced himself and got ready to launch an attack of his own. Outnumbered 6 to 1, he knew it would never do to let them get hold of him. So he prepared to hit the one furthest from the agent in hopes that he could either escape through the hole or else get his bottle and use it as a weapon. He became tauter and prepared for a rush at them when suddenly the door flew open and what looked like the biggest man Dan had ever seen came barging into the room. "What's going on here?" he bellowed, and pushed them apart as though they were nothing. "We're going to give the preacher a drink," whined one of the drunks, and Dan noted that the agent was slowly backing toward the door. "I don't drink, and I'm not taking that," said Dan hurriedly. "You guys get out of here," bellowed the big man and shoved them out like a straw. As they went out the door, the agent went with them. But the big man turned to Dan and said, "Which one?" "The tall one with sandy hair," shouted Dan after him. "Get his dog tag." The door slammed shut and Dan stood alone, too shaken to move for some moments. Once again, he had been near death, and once again, he had been delivered. It had to be the Lord that protected him. Picking up his bag, he slipped into a booth, latched the door, and silently gave vent to his feelings, while at the same time thanking God for his protective care. When after some time he made his way down the stairs to the lobby, he found a group around one of the ticket windows still talking about the crowd who fell down the stairs. "What happened up there?" asked the ticket agent. "I don't really know," Dan answered truthfully, for he was still puzzled by the whole affair. "Well, I never saw such a scared-looking bunch in all my life," volunteered one of the men. "They acted like the old devil was after them." "Maybe he was," commented Dan, and then added, "Say, how many came down the stairs?" "6. Did you see the big man after them?" One old man chuckled. "There wasn't anything after them but a streak of blue smoke." More puzzled than ever, Dan sought a seat away from the crowd to think and pray. He was never to know how his protector got out without being seen. But there must have been another exit. For a long time he sat quietly trying to decide what to do. It seemed evident to him that he had failed in this mission. His quarry was gone with the secret documents. His identity had been revealed to the enemy, and he was now more marked for extinction by them than ever before. Some 2 hours passed before he could get up the courage enough to contact 35. Finally, he found a secluded phone booth in the terminal and dialed the special number. 21 plus calling 35. Leave the number where you are and he will contact you in a few minutes. As he hung up, Dan once again wondered how they could have a system that worked so quickly and so perfectly. He was never to learn. He had removed his disguise before leaving the restroom, so now opened his bag and began reading his Bible, listening meanwhile for the phone in the booth to ring. He didn't have long to wait, and when he said hello, he was both surprised and delighted. "Congratulations!" boomed the voice of 35. "You really did a good job, and I'm sure Mr. Big will want to see you now." "Wait a minute," and Dan's voice was pleading. "I don't know what you're talking about. I failed on this assignment, and I'm ready to resign." "I'm sorry, 21 plus," came the truly concerned voice from the other end. "I forgot that you didn't know what happened. Man, you didn't fail. You played it just right, and that part of the story is closed." "You mean the enemy didn't get away, and he didn't get the papers to Canada, and the enemy agents don't know who I am?" "That's right, son," and 35 spoke almost fondly to the nervous, scared young preacher. "No, you didn't let him get away, and the papers are back in our hands, and he is dead. So he will never be able to tell anyone who you are. In fact, if we dared, we would put your picture on the front page of every paper in this country tomorrow. But of course, we can't do that." Then changing back to his usual tone and manner, he quipped, "Say, where are you preaching tomorrow?" Dan straightened suddenly. In the excitement and fright, he had forgotten about the church that wanted him to visit them. Laughing for the first time in several days, he said, "I'm not sure anyone will want me, but I may be at R. Bring all of your friends and come to hear the worst scared preacher in the nation." "I wish I could," and 35 seemed sincere. "I would take a good skinning from a preacher like you. I can't be there, but 1 or 2 of our men will be. We want to see that you get back home all right. Oh, by the way, old big boy who was on the bus with you and came to your rescue said he sure did like your spunk. Bye now." And he was gone. Dan did preach in that other city on Sunday, and there were 2 visiting men in the congregation, whom no one knew, but whose business Dan knew. And the folk did like his preaching, and invited him back as often as possible. And when he arrived back home, he could honestly tell Lori and the boys about the nice weekend he had enjoyed in that New York City. But it was a long time before his nerves calmed again. Lori and the boys wondered at his tension and tried hard to put up with his jittery disposition.